Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're going to be discussing a very interesting topic, and this was something that I had sort of brought up a few days ago in my bold predictions video, which was that the San Jose Sharks would end up making a big trade in this upcoming season, and I had made sure to mention that the biggest trade possibility would be a move involving Sharks forward Tomas Hertl. However, I also made sure to mention that I didn't necessarily agree with that move. It was just something that I was predicting to have happen. However, since I've made that video, there have been a lot of trade rumors floating around about Tomas Hertl. There have been quotes given by Hertl to the media, and I've thought about it more, and now I'm coming to realize, well, would it be the worst thing in the world to trade Tomas Hertl, which is obviously the topic of this video. Should the Sharks extend Hertl, or should they actually trade him? So let us first talk about what exactly a Tomas Hertl trade would look like. Just a few days ago, it was Christian Dvorak of the Arizona Coyotes who ended up getting traded from the Coyotes to the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for a first and a second round pick. Now, this isn't a great comparable because Dvorak is noticeably a worse player than Tomas Hertl. Hertl is pretty securely a number one center in the league as a 70-point player, 30-goal scorer, while Christian Dvorak is much more secure in the second line center position as maybe a 20-goal, 40 or 50-point kind of guy. However, the one thing Dvorak does have over Hertl is he is a bit cost controlled. Dvorak is on a contract for the next few years at about $4.5 million or so, while Hertl, while you would have him at a very solid 5.625 for the next season, you would obviously be forced to re-sign him or let him go at the end of this year. So a preseason Tomas Hertl trade would probably end up getting at least a couple of first-round picks. However, judging by how Doug Wilson has played this off-season, you're not really expecting the Sharks to kind of stray away from being competitive. There was no reason to sign a player like Nick Bonino and Andrew Cogliano if you were planning on then just trading Tomas Hertl before season start, because your team would end up just being worse in general. As such, if a trade were to materialize, it would likely happen during the actual season around the trade deadline, where we actually have a much more sort of decent comparable to go for, which would be the trade of Taylor Hall a few years ago by the New Jersey Devils to, ironically enough, the Arizona Coyotes. In that trade, Taylor Hall was sent to the Coyotes in exchange for three sort of borderline AHL to NHL type of players. In fact, just to give you the idea of the type of players that came back, one of them was actually Nick Merkley, who is now a San Jose Shark, as he was traded for during this past offseason with the New Jersey Devils. However, the real meat and potatoes of this Taylor Hall trade were the two draft picks acquired, the first being a first-round pick, which the only condition on that was that if it ended up being a top 3 overall pick, it would move on to the next season. As such, if the Arizona Coyotes, let's say, had missed the playoffs that season, the Devils could have still very well ended up with, a top 15 overall pick from the Taylor Hall trade. The second draft pick was a third round pick, which could conditionally become a second round pick if the Coyotes had either re-signed Taylor Hall or won a playoff series that year, and it could have become a first round pick had the Coyotes done both of those things, as in re-sign Hall and win a playoff series, which means Taylor Hall got at least a first-round pick and probably around a second-round pick. Obviously, this did not end up being the case, as I don't believe the Coyotes actually won a playoff series, because I don't think the play-in series that they won actually ended up counting. However, if you're trading Hertl to a team, you're kind of hoping that would go better, so you would likely end up with a bit of a better result. It should also be noted that while Taylor Hall is a more skilled player than Hertl, obviously Taylor Hall was a Hart Memorial Trophy winner, I do think Hertl carries potentially more value for a team that's actually looking to compete in the playoffs, for a multitude of reasons. First of all, Hertl is a centerman compared to the winger that Taylor Hall is, and a lot of teams, especially heading into the playoffs, will value a centerman significantly more than they would value a winger. It should also be noted that Tomas Hertl has significantly more playoff experience than Taylor Hall did at the time. Taylor Hall in his career had played, at the moment of that trade, 6 playoff games, all of them in a single year with the New Jersey Devils, a round 1 loss. Meanwhile, Tomas Hertl had over 10 times more playoff games at 62 career playoff games and was a noted playoff performer compared to Taylor Hall, who was definitely a wild card at that. And another reason Hertl is definitely the type of player who kind of thrives in the playoffs just by the way he actually plays the game, compared to Taylor Hall, who is very skilled, but could be seen more as a perimeter type of player that maybe won't have as much success in the playoffs. And so coming up to a trade deadline, even though Taylor Hall might have the skill advantage, I feel as though the intangibles that Tomas Hertl would have would likely make it so that he could be even worth more than what Taylor Hall got at the trade deadline a couple of years ago. So having established that, it seems as though that a Tomas Hertl trade would actually be pretty good for the Sharks in terms of assets. But of course now the question would become, should the Sharks actually trade Hertl, or should they try and aim for an extension? Well, the next thing should be, well, if there's no trade, and if the Sharks decide to go for an extension, will there be a possibility that Tomas Hertl actually ends up just walking in free agency? Because that is definitely a situation that you want to avoid. And we could take a look at another similar situation a few years ago with John Tavares of the New York Islanders. The Islanders were struggling during the season. It was the last year of John Tavares' contract, and the Islanders were thinking they could potentially try and trade him. However, Tavares seemed to be stringing along the Islanders, saying, oh yeah, definitely I'll re-sign with New York, don't worry about it. And so the trade deadline came and went with Tavares still on the Islanders roster. But of course, as Sharks fans will be aware of, by that off season, the Islanders were unable to re-sign Tavares, and he would end up signing with the Toronto Maple Leafs. And while the Islanders are no worse for wear now, as since that has happened, they have become a perennial playoff contender. However, they probably would have been significantly more happy had they actually managed to trade Tavares, let's say, at the deadline, and gotten a couple first-round picks for their troubles with how good of a player John Tavares was. So the Sharks do not want to end up in a situation like that, meaning if they do not end up trading Tomas Hertl, they must sign him to an extension. Now, what would an extension actually look like? And this is probably where we have the most comparable situation possible. Just a couple of weeks ago or so, it was the Philadelphia Flyers who signed centerman Sean Couturier to an 8-year deal worth $7.75 million. And Couturier and Hertl are two very, very similar players. Both of them are first-line centers at the NHL, 30 goal scorers, 70-point scorers. Both are pretty solid in the playoffs, though Hertl may be a touch more playoff experience, while both are very solid defensively, Sean Couturier with maybe a bit of an edge defensively. And in the end, the real major difference between them is the fact that Sean Couturier is 1 year older than Tomas Hertl right now. However, Hertl will actually be signing his contract at the exact same age as Sean Couturier was. So pretty much, this is pretty clearly two very, very even players. As such, it is expected that Hertl would probably sign for more or less the same amount, give or take a couple $100,000, somewhere between the $7.5 and $8 million range. And for a lot of Sharks fans, that seems as though that's something to jump on immediately. You know, the fact that, oh wow, Tomas Hertl, we all love him. He's been such a great player for the San Jose Sharks. Been here since he was drafted by the Sharks in 2012. Very likable player as well. Why not immediately just sign him for the 8 years at $8 million? Well, may I remind you that a lot of the Sharks contracts that people complain about now, those of, Brent Burns, Marc-Edouard Vlasic, Logan Couture, those were once players who needed an extension that fans were immediately jumping on to try and extend them. And when they actually were announced as extensions, fans were actually mostly positive about them. Even a Vlasic contract that immediately kind of went downhill within the first couple of seasons, at the time of signing it, people were saying, oh, Vlasic deserved it. He's been so good for the Sharks, criminally underpaid in the past, super underrated player. He definitely deserves the $7 million. And now people look at that Vlasic contract and say this is one of the worst deals in the NHL. I'm not saying that Tomas Hertl's extension would end up like that, but I'm saying maybe don't be so quick to try and re-sign him at an 8-year deal at $8 million. And there's also another major difference between a potential Tomas Hertl extension and the extension for some of those other players, which will get me onto a bit of a tangent about these types of extensions. Because while the Vlasic, Couture, and Burns contracts obviously look pretty bad at this point, I will say, and this is a hill I will die on, that at the time of signing it, at the very least with Brent Burns' contract, this was a well-intentioned deal and one that I would still make again today. You see, Brent Burns was signed, the first a few weeks into the 2016-2017 season. He was just coming off of a 70-point year or 75-point year in which the Sharks had made the Stanley Cup Finals. He would end up signing this extension during a year where he would end up winning the James Norris in. And so 8 years at $8 million seems extremely fair. And I know a lot of people will always talk about, well, why are you giving 8 years to a player who is 31 or 32 years of age? Well, the fact of the matter is that when you are signing a very, very good player who also happens to be middle-aged, 28, 29, 30 years old, you will always be forced to give them the max term, because you should know that if you do not give them the max term, they will just walk in free agency, and there are 29 or 30, or I guess now 31 other teams who will be absolutely lined up outside of his door trying to sign him to a max term deal. And so if you're not going to be one to give it to them, somebody else will. And you're kind of just losing tons and tons of value by giving up fantastic players like Brent Burns was at the time by not re-signing him. So if you're the San Jose Sharks, you sign him for that 8-year deal because you kind of have to. Because imagine, 8-year deals at $8 million, that's $64 million over that time. Let's say you as a GM decided, you know what, I don't think Brent Burns is going to be good for those last 3 years. I'm going to sign him for a 5-year deal instead. If you wanted to give him the similar type of money, exactly $64 million still, you would have had to sign him for $12.8 million per year to equal an 8x8 contract, which is just insanity because a $12.8 million cap hit is just impossible to deal with, especially 4 or 5 years ago when the contract actually was signed. And so GMs, they are very much aware that when they sign players who are 29, 30 years old to 8-year extensions, that the last 2 or 3 years of that contract likely are not going to be particularly good. Do you really think when Doug Wilson put pen to paper to sign Brent Burns to that extension, he was thinking, yeah, Brent Burns is definitely going to be an 80-point player at the age of 39 in the last year of this contract? Obviously not, but it's a sacrifice that you make to get those first 4 or 5 years out of that player. And Brent Burns was pretty good for those first 4 years, as we've seen thus far. The first 2 years, obviously fantastic. 80 ended up being an 82-point player during the second year of this contract. The past 2 years, 1920 and 2021, he's obviously fallen off significantly offensively, but we can't put too much blame onto him as the entire Sharks team has fallen off in general. But so I would say that the first 4 years certainly weren't too bad. So basically the point that I'm trying to make is that when you sign an 8-year contract, you're usually expecting the first 5 years to be solid, but maybe the last 2-3 years to not be all that great, and it's a necessary evil. So now let's wrap this back around to a potential Tomas Hertl extension. The major difference between the Hertl extension and the previous extensions the Sharks have signed with Burns, Couture, and Vlasic is the fact that those 3 extensions were signed when the Sharks were still competitive and were looking to be competitive in the following seasons. 2016, when Burns' extension was announced, that was the year the Sharks made the playoffs. They were hoping to make the playoffs in the following year, the year after that, and that's exactly what happened. And the same goes for Couture and Vlasic. With Tomas Hertl, the Sharks have missed the playoffs for the past 2 seasons. And let's say if the Sharks do indeed miss the playoffs for this upcoming year as well, you'd be signing Tomas Hertl in a situation where you're not necessarily a very competitive team. And you see, if the Sharks actually end up doing poorly this season, it's very possible that they may just force their hand into a rebuild of sorts. And the fact is that rebuilds can take a pretty long time. Even looking at a best case scenario, which we could look at maybe the New York Rangers as of late, this was a team that completely lucked in the draft lottery to both Capo Caco at 2nd overall in 2019 and Alexis Lafreniere at 1st overall in 2020, plus signed an elite young forward, or decently young forward, in Artemi Panarin in free agency, and had a young defensive stud in Adam Fox, future Norris contender, sign with them out of college, out of every single possible other team to choose from. And even so, the Rangers have been out of the playoffs for 4 years now, only now looking to be competitive in this 5th year. And to put that into perspective, the Sharks, if they were to miss the playoffs in this upcoming season, would have been missing for the 3rd year in a row. So even in a best case scenario, the Sharks probably wouldn't even look to be competitive in the 1st year of a new Tomas Hertl extension. But more realistically, the Sharks would probably be in line more for a Los Angeles Kings or a Detroit Red Wings style of rebuild that could easily take, 5, 6, 7 years. At which point, maybe the Sharks won't even look to be competitive until the 24-25, maybe even 25-26 season. At which point, that would be the third or maybe even fourth year of a potential Tomas Hertl 8-year extension. So taking with what I said earlier, if you're already expecting the last 2 to 3 years at ages 34, 35, 36 to not be particularly good for Tomas Hertl, and you're going to be a rebuilding team, and as such, you're not expecting the first 2 or 3 years of this Tomas Hertl contract, the Sharks to actually be competitive, realistically, you would end up only actually signing Tomas Hertl and hoping that he's going to do good for your team and help you win a Stanley Cup for maybe 2 or 3 years of the 8-year extension. So while, the 2 or 3 years at the end tacked on are a necessary evil because you still get 5 good years, the fact that you would only realistically be getting 2 to maybe 3 good years of Tomas Hertl is not really something that is looked upon super favorably. And so to wrap it all up at the end here, the question is, of course, should the Sharks trade Tomas Hertl or should they actually try and sign an extension? Well, in the end, it all comes down to how the San Jose Sharks actually end up doing in this upcoming season. If they end up doing well, then maybe an extension could be in the books. However, it should be mentioned that when I say if they end up doing well, well needs to be squarely into the playoffs with a potential chance of actually competing. If the trade deadline rolls around and the Sharks are, in the playoff race, but maybe 1 point out, or even if they happen to be sitting in a wild card spot, but it's very, very close, that's not what I would consider well. The fact is, even if you manage to squeak into the playoffs and then lose in the first round to the Vegas Golden Knights, it is not worth losing Tomas Hertl for nothing in free agency just so you could lose in the first round of the playoffs. You have to be sure that you're actually going to be competitive at the playoff level if you want to be retaining Tomas Hertl. Otherwise, if you don't end up having a pretty good season, you end up 6th, 7th, maybe even last place in the Pacific Division by the time the trade deadline rolls around, I would say that you absolutely should be looking at that point to trade Tomas Hertl to recoup some assets so you don't end up in a similar situation as the New York Islanders were with John Tavares just a few years ago. It's sad to say, we all like Tomas Hertl, but the fact is that, again, based on some of the comments that he has made just this past offseason and the way the Sharks have been going these past couple of years, it's a fact that you might not really need to keep a player like Tomas Hertl because he may not even be all that useful for the foreseeable future. Class dismissed.